Well, thank you. I suppose I can say my fellow Americans for probably the first time. It was a 7-year wait, but it was worth it. What I want to do tonight in the speech is to talk about the Second Amendment within the Constitution. And then during the question and answer section, I thought we could talk a bit more about gun control, where we are today. One of the problems that we have at the moment is that a reasonably large portion of the progressives in this country don't just want more gun control, but are unwilling to acknowledge the plain meaning of one of the provisions within the Bill of Rights. I'm sure this has happened to you. If you want to show your hand, if it has, someone has said, well, it doesn't matter anyway because the Second Amendment doesn't actually protect an individual right. How many of you have heard that? Right. That is absolute nonsense. And I hope by the time that I've finished, I'll have gone through why. It is bizarrely frequently said in progressive circles that Justice Scalia invented the right to bear arms in 2008 with the Heller decision. There are a number of reasons that this case is made. One is that until 2008, the Second Amendment had never been deemed to be an individual right, which is true, but is also misleading in that there was no federal gun control law passed until 1934, and there were only 2 federal Second Amendment cases, or have ever really been 2 federal Second Amendment cases. So it's a little bit like saying, well, because there was no First Amendment case at the federal level until the early 20th century, then all of the laws before that must have been okay. It is a lie. It is the equivalent of moon landing trutherism, and it is unfortunately spreading, especially within universities. The dissent in Heller, which was penned by Justice John Paul Stevens, is a rewriting of history. It is revisionist history, and I don't know how many of you saw recently, but having failed to read the right to bear arms out of the Second Amendment, he then took to the New York Times last week and proposed repealing the thing in toto, the main response to which from his ideological allies was not to say that's a bad idea, but don't say that or they'll say you're saying that. But he did say that, and he will probably not be with us too much longer, but his ideological allies will. And if there was ever a reminder that it is important not to have people like that on the Supreme Court of the United States, I think we got it last week. I'll say it again. The notion that the Second Amendment does not protect an individual right is the legal equivalent of moon landing trutherism, and it should be treated as such. If you go back to the time of the founding, pretty much everybody is clear on what it meant and why it was in there. The way it is written, there is a prefatory clause before the operative clause, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, was common at the time. It was not odd, it was not peculiar, it was not a one-off. This was often how constitutional provisions were introduced, an explanation and then the law itself. The term arms is not controversial. The term arms at the time covered anything that a normal individual could expect to carry about his person. It didn't include bombs or cannon, although at the time of the founding those were perfectly legal. But it did include pistols, carbines, an AR-15 is a carbine, rifles, muskets, and so forth. Well-regulated is not a strange term. It doesn't mean regulation in the modern sense. It means disciplined. If you read Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, Elizabeth Bennet refers constantly to Mr. Darcy's well-regulated temper. I don't think she means that the government is in charge of him. Reading history and literature in context is not that difficult. And militia at the time of the founding meant every able-bodied male. It did not mean the National Guard. The idea that the National Guard, which was founded in, I think 1920, somehow changes the meaning of a word that was well established within Anglo-American history, again, is revisionism. So if you'll indulge me, I want to go through some of the history here just to make it plain what the amendment means, but also why it is so important and how it was seen, because if we don't present it properly, then this argument will be harder and harder to win. The English, long before they started confiscating screwdrivers and pliers from the good people of London, were worried about royal authority. In the time of Charles I, the monarch used the militia to disarm his political opponents. That is one of the reasons that in the 1688 Bill of Rights there is a provision, although it only applied to Protestants, ensuring that people could not be disarmed. It's the reason that this came up during the debates over the Bill of Rights and the US Constitution, because people remembered having been disarmed in the 17th century by the king. This is unfortunate, I think, to acknowledge today, because it makes us all sound wild-eyed, but it was presumed and assumed in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries that if the people needed to, they should be able to overthrow a tyrannical government. That is often downplayed, but it is nevertheless true. Noah Webster, of dictionary fame, wrote, "The supreme power in America cannot enforce unjust laws by the sword, because the whole body of the people are armed and constitute a force superior to any bands of regular troops that can be on any pretense raised in the United States." Sam Adams, at the time of the founding, said something almost identical. He said, "Be never construed to authorize Congress to infringe the just liberty of the press or the rights of conscience, or to prevent the people of the United States, who are peaceable citizens, from keeping their own arms." The two men in question had read their history, and they had seen what happened when the monarch was given too much power. At the time of ratification of the Bill of Rights, there was no gun control debate. This is another odd part of our national conversation on guns, as if the founders met and said, well, should we allow people to own muskets? Should we allow people to own pistols? It was simply assumed. The question at the time was how best to protect liberty. And when the Bill of Rights was proposed, many of the founding fathers believed that it was unnecessary because the government had never been given the power to take guns or to manage speech in the first place. But it was necessary to pass a Bill of Rights as a result of a compromise, and so they did. And when it was drafted, it was widely debated, and a lawyer called Tench Coxe wrote in the Federal Gazette in 1789 that the Second Amendment confirms the people's right to bear their private arms against civil rulers and military forces that might pervert their power to the injury of their fellow citizens. Now, clearly, Tench Coxe was regarded as such a crazy right-wing nut job by James Madison that James Madison wrote him a letter thanking him for the explanation and agreeing with it. George Washington then made him Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. St. George Tucker, who was one of the great jurists of the era, who interpreted Blackstone's commentaries, which had so informed the founders, explained that in America the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, and this without any qualification as to their condition or degree, as is the case in the British government. He described the Second Amendment in the same work as the true palladium of liberty. Tucker, again, was so reviled by James Madison, who wrote the Second Amendment, that James Madison put him on the federal bench in 1813. In 1825, William Rawle, I won't do this all day, but I think it's worth making the point. William Rawle wrote the early 19th century's best legal textbook, and explained, the right of the people to bear arms shall not be infringed. The prohibition is general. No clause in the Constitution could by any rule of construction be conceived to give to Congress a power to disarm the people. Again, William Rule inspired such anger in the authors of the Constitution that George Washington asked him to serve as the first Attorney General. And so on and so forth. Joseph Story, who was probably the second most influential jurist in the 19th century, wrote similar things and was put on the Supreme Court by James Madison. This is not a controversy. This is an attempt to revise history. This is an attempt to change what is abundantly true in order to meet a current political debate. If you read any point in American history, except for the middle of the 20th century, you will find ample evidence that the right to keep and bear arms was deemed to be an individual right and was deemed to be fundamental to the American conception of good government. And you can see this in more unpleasant circumstances. In the Dred Scott decision that in part led to the Civil War, Justice Tawney explains that if African Americans were allowed to become citizens, they would start indulging their natural rights, one of which he lists as the right to bear arms. And after the Civil War, those who drafted the 14th Amendment said, damn straight. If you read the debates over the 14th Amendment, it was very, very clear, both from the drafters and the co-sponsors, that that was exactly what they expected, that the privileges and immunities would apply to everybody. And those privileges and immunities included the right to bear arms. And then we start to get toward the 20th century. And there is a concerted attempt to ignore the Second Amendment as if it is somewhat embarrassing. And oddly enough, Justice Thomas Cooley, who was the late 19th century equivalent of a Joseph Story, worried aloud in his textbook of the era that this would start to happen. He thought the way that the amendment was written would allow people to lie about what it meant, to become confused about what it meant. And of course, that is exactly what started to happen. By the time that we reach the 1940s and the 1950s, it has been decided by the ever-expanding government that the Second Amendment is a bit embarrassing, and that it would be better if it didn't exist. And so you start to see the view that is now held on the left. That view came within one vote of becoming American law in the seminal case on this question. Had Justice Scalia died in 2007, it is possible that the Second Amendment would have been written out of the Constitution. It is an extraordinary thought, akin to a court deciding that freedom of speech doesn't actually mean of speech. That people in the Bill of Rights doesn't mean people. That right doesn't mean right. The argument made by Justice Stevens is that the founders, who were assiduously careful everywhere to say what they meant, state, people, nation, put into what is an unsparing charter of individual rights the right of individuals to join state organizations which the federal government can abolish. I mean, this is irrational nonsense, but it is irrational nonsense that is taught with exuberance at Harvard and Yale and Stanford, and which has a lot of purchase within academia and also within the press, unfortunately. And I think this is a problem for two reasons. Firstly, because when you review the history, it is so obvious what was meant by the amendment. But also because in order to believe the lie, you have to have a completely inverted conception of what the American government was set up to do. The American government was set up to play certain roles, the primary one of which is to protect individual liberty, but to do nothing else. In the United States, it is the people who are sovereign. It is the people who are assumed to inherit power unless otherwise stated. When you think about it, it makes absolutely no sense in a free country for the elected representatives of a government that is subordinate to the people to be able to turn around and then disarm those people. And this is always a point that needs to be made delicately. But when somebody says, why do you need an AR-15? The correct rejoinder is, why don't you want me to have one? The United States had no police forces until the 1830s, when the Chicago police force was found and echoed the Metropolitan Police that was set up in London. But even then, it was set up on the understanding that it represented an auxiliary force, that it was not a replacement for the role of the citizen. It was a help. It was an aid. Still, this is the case. The Supreme Court has ruled that the police have no obligation whatsoever to help you if you are in trouble. That's your lookout. Hopefully they will help you. This is in no way to disparage the police, but the police are there as an auxiliary force. They are not there as a replacement. And given that, to try to take away the foundational idea that you control your life, your liberty, and in the original formulation, your property, which was changed to pursuit of happiness by an exuberant Thomas Jefferson, I think is extremely problematic. It's also problematic because the defining line in American history between free men and slaves has been whether you are allowed to own weapons in your defense or not. This is not rhetoric, it is not an overstatement. If you go back to England, Catholics were excluded from the ownership of arms in 1688 because they weren't trusted and they weren't regarded as full citizens. It said the subjects which are Protestants may have arms for their defense, and this was seized upon by the aristocracy, which was terrified of an uprising, as a pretext to take away guns from those they feared. In Canada, the first serious gun control laws were passed between 1911 and 1913 in a bit of a panic about non-British immigrants. People who were, in the words of the laws of the time, disciples of the torch and bomb, whose behavior was disgraced by bad habits, notions, and vicious practices. Now, I like British people, I am one, but to describe everyone who isn't British in those terms strikes me as a little bit too far. And America's history is even clearer on this. The first gun control laws in the United States were passed to disarm Indians in the Massachusetts and Plymouth colonies. In Louisiana, the Black Codes required free French colonists not only to disarm, but to beat any non-white person carrying a potential weapon. And of course, after the Revolution and then the Civil War, free men were those who were entitled to arms and not anybody else. And I don't for one moment think that the majority of people who are today calling for stricter gun control do so for racial reasons. But if you go back even as recently as 1968, gun control measures were an ill-veiled attempt to disarm inner-city African Americans. The Gun Control Act of 1968 is a perfect example of that. This has long been a dividing line between those who are trusted to run their own affairs and those who are not. We should feel comforted, though, by the fact that while this debate rages still at the federal level, at the state level it has thankfully been clearer for a while. 44 state constitutions have their own right to keep and bear arms, and they're not just the old ones. You know, you might expect, if we were talking about an antiquated right that has been misinterpreted, as progressives insist, to find it in Connecticut, to find it in Massachusetts, to find it in Georgia. But actually, both Alaska, which was brought into the Union in the 1950s, has its own right to bear arms. Wisconsin added a right to bear arms in 1998. That's how recently it was put in. This has been a popular and important part of American culture, and I think that this is one area in which, and you probably don't hear a great deal of this being conservatives in Silicon Valley, but in which you should take heart. Over the last 30 years, the restoration of the right to keep and bear arms in America has been extraordinary. If you go back to the 1950s, there was a majority in favor of a total handgun ban. If you go back to the 1990s, a slew of anti-gun legislation passed, some of it with the NRA's support. Ronald Reagan wrote a letter to the New York Times backing the so-called assault weapons ban in 1994. That it would be unthinkable now. There were only a handful of states that had concealed carry regimes. Now all 50 do. There are some exceptions. California has one. It's not particularly robust, as I'm sure you know. The same is true in New Jersey. But it's still better than it was. Not only that, but you have pro-gun majorities, thankfully, on the Supreme Court, and increasingly on the lower courts. You have a doubling of the number of privately owned firearms, and crime has been cut in half over 30 years, including gun crime. It is much, much safer in America now than it was 30 years ago. And this is despite some of the most appalling fear-mongering. Back in 1987, when Florida announced that it would be giving a concealed carry permit to anybody who qualified, the New York Times christened Florida the gunshine state and warned its readers over and over again that everybody in Florida would soon be dead. The circumstances of their deaths were quite interesting. They would start shooting each other if they were cut off in traffic, or if somebody got the last croissant at Publix. And anyone drank, they would probably just go out and kill a few people. Why not? Well, we actually have data from both Texas and Florida. They're the only two states that keep it. And concealed carry permit holders are 7 times more law-abiding than the police. So that didn't work out. Likewise, we were told that the loosening of the laws at the federal and state level would lead to a surge in crime. Well, the peak of American crime came in 1993. Since then, it has dropped and dropped and dropped and dropped as people have bought more and more guns, become more and more proficient with them, obtained concealed carry permits, taken classes, and so forth. I assume you know that doesn't mean that people have stopped making these predictions. In 2010, so what, 23 years after Florida changed the law, the governor of Illinois said in a press conference that Illinois couldn't get concealed carry because people would start shooting each other in the supermarket if they bumped shopping trolleys. But the good part of the story is that this time nobody believed him, and it passed anyway in a state that is obviously heavily democratic. So I think that there is a lot to be thankful for, but I would recommend to anybody who wants to keep fighting on this that there are some real threats. The first one is that if it could get away with it, the left would put in judges who are willing to lie about American history, and they would invert this key signifier of the relationship between the citizen and the state. It has been very interesting to me as somebody who watches this closely to see how the rhetoric has changed since the election of Donald Trump. Before Donald Trump won the election, the official line from sites such as Think Progress was that anybody who thought that the Second Amendment was going to be written out of the Constitution was paranoid. And since Donald Trump's election, they openly say it's very disappointing that Donald Trump won because we were just on the cusp of having a fifth justice who would rewrite the Heller decision. I think we should take that to heart and make sure that those judges don't get anywhere near the Supreme Court. I think the other challenge is that we have been as successful as we have been. Now, as conservatives, we don't hear that too often. But it can be difficult when crime has dropped in the way that it has, when the laws have been restored in the way that they have, to keep the momentum going and to prevent the politicians from getting complacent. There is no less strength of feeling on this in the gun control movement today than there was 30 years ago. You often hear it complained that we never have a national conversation on guns. We always have a national conversation on guns. They just lose. But it's not a conversation that is going to stop. And I think it would be a mistake to assume this one had been won and then to move on. So in a moment I will take any questions and probably tease out some more of the issues that are facing us. But I think it is always worth keeping this within its philosophical context, much in the same way as the attitudes toward free speech that we're seeing on college campuses are infantilizing of a free people. Much as they imply that what we really need is an enlightened cast of people who can decide what is and what is not acceptable, what is and what is not hate speech, in order to protect us from ourselves. The notion that human nature has become sufficiently pleasant to permit free people to disarm and to render what has for centuries been a key part of the Anglo-American tradition moot, I think is an extraordinary one. And the history shows that extremely clearly. Thank you.
Before getting the cards, I've got a couple of questions sort of lined up. And that has to do with getting rid of some mythology. If you hear about the Second Amendment from the progressive side, there are two things that you hear all the time I'd like you to discuss. One is the gun show loophole, and the other is assault rifles or assault weapons. What does that really mean?
So the gun show loophole is the idea that there is a special set of rules that apply at gun shows that don't apply elsewhere. This is a silly one for a number of reasons. Firstly, criminals don't buy their guns at gun shows. I don't quite know where this came from. Criminals, the statistics show, buy their guns on the black market from criminal networks that sell guns. A much bigger problem as regards criminal use of firearms is straw purchases, which is when you buy a gun for somebody who's not allowed it. But that is already illegal. And straw purchase convictions are up 25% in the last year. This is something the administration has been very good on. It is simply not the case that different rules apply at a gun show. If you are obliged to run a background check, if you're a federally licensed firearms dealer, you are obliged to do that whether you're selling the gun at a gun show, in your store, or at a kitchen table. And if in certain states, not California, but if in certain states where you're allowed to sell a gun privately to somebody without a background check, you sell a gun at a gun show, you don't have to run a background check whether you're at a gun show or at their table or in a parking lot or at a friend's house. There is no exemption for gun shows. I think this idea came about because of the shooting at Columbine, because one of the guns came from a gun show. But it seems to me that to focus on that is to miss the forest for the trees, that the two young men who perpetrated that crime were not old enough to own guns in the first place. The guns that they bought were illegal under federal law, and the person who got them for them committed a straw purchase. So to invent a whole category of supposed crime is odd. I mean, I think this is something just to look out for in general. Generally speaking, when progressives use the term loophole, what they mean is law Congress passed that I don't like. And in this case, it was a deliberate rule. It was debated. You can go back and read the debates on the floor. You might agree with them, you might disagree with them, that's fine, but it isn't a loophole just because you don't like it. In terms of assault weapons, I mean, for goodness sake, this is this is such a linguistic trick. There is no established definition of an assault weapon. Essentially, what the likes of your lovely Senator Dianne Feinstein want to do is to establish up front that we all agree nobody should have an assault weapon, and then to determine what is an assault weapon. That is how it works. That's how it worked in 1994. It's how the bill she introduced that got only 40 votes in the Senate worked in 2013. It's how her most recent bill, which is thankfully going nowhere, works as well. There's no category of assault weapon. It is a trick, and it relies upon the idea that there are just some guns that are just too dangerous for you to own, but only on cosmetic grounds. This is an insidious trick, and I think conservatives have to push back against it, because if you actually look at what is meant, practically speaking, by so-called assault weapons, it would, if put into law, outlaw half the guns in the country that are sold, which is, of course, the point. So, yeah, those two really are pernicious.
Yeah, we hear those all the time. Well, we'll start out somewhat light. Someone wants to know how come a Brit knows so much about our Constitution.
Well, I think, yeah, former Brit, yeah. Well, I suppose there are a number of things. The US Constitution is filled with British ideas that the British have abandoned. It is not British. It is an improvement, in my view, on the Glorious Revolution, but it didn't spring out of nowhere. It is an enormous irony that in order to enjoy the rights to which I am supposed to be heir as an Englishman, I had to come 3,000 miles across the sea. But I did, and I think that had an effect on me. My background is in 18th century history, and I can't overstate the degree to which discovering the American founding just changed my life. I didn't have any politics other than that I just inherited from the heir. And when I eventually read the Federalist Papers, I thought, that's what I am. I'm one of those. Which makes you a bit weird in college, you know. Who are you voting for? I'm voting for Alexander Hamilton and the federal farmer. But no, one thing I think that has really focused my mind on this is that the United States is really the incubator of classically liberal Anglo-American values, and it is the last place that has maintained them. They're not fully intact, but they're much more so than anywhere else. And if they go here, they will exist nowhere in the world, and I think they won't come back ever. And I don't, no, not I don't want, I will not let that happen in my lifetime, because this is, I think, the last great hope. And if you read the documents that led to the US Constitution and the founding, and you see how sure of its precepts those who wrote it were, and then you watch the countries start to track apart over the next 200 years, you can see how it happens. And I'm one person out of very many, but it's incredibly important to me that this country doesn't take the same road.
Here's a term we haven't heard in a while, fast and furious. Do you think this was intended for gun control?
I think that the incredible incompetence of Eric Holder played a role. I tend to think, on average, that the mistakes that are made by the gun control movement are born more of ignorance than malice, with the exception of the attempt to rewrite history. And I'll tell you why. Because I think that for many on the left, this is a cultural issue as much as anything else. I think they don't just dislike guns, I think they dislike the people who like guns. And I think as a result, I think there is a cultural block to learning about them because guns are icky. You know, guns, Barack Obama said it quite well in 2008. How he saw it was that people were clinging to their guns and their religion, and that was clearly not a compliment. I mean, everyone at National Review thinks that's a compliment, but I don't think he meant it that way. And I think that as a result, there is a degree of incompetence that is baffling to me, but that is there nonetheless. So no, I don't think that was a plot, but I do think it was a great example of why Eric Holder shouldn't be allowed to run anything.
That's for sure. Long range, do you think there'll be an effect for the student marches like we just saw in Washington after Parkland? Have you discussed that?
Well, I'm a skeptic about their influence, I must say. I did wonder when they first started marching, but I think they've made a few mistakes. There was a Washington Post analysis that showed that only 12% of the new marches on that day were actually there for gun control. The rest were there for more amorphous concepts like world peace, or they were against Donald Trump. That's not the level of intensity you need for a world-changing movement. And it reminded me very much of Occupy Wall Street, which I covered for 3 months back in 2011. And, I went down there pretty much every day in New York for 3 months, and I would talk to the protesters. And the thing that struck me immediately was that the vast majority of them, and this seemed to be true with the gun control march as well, were serial protesters. They were very much involved in politics, which is fine, good for them. It's America, they have a First Amendment right. But when someone says the most important issue in the world is this one, but also the last 25 that I came out for, then you're unlikely to see the sort of intensity that you need. And that, I think, was very much evident with Parkland. The other reason is that I think that the whole thing has collapsed into infighting. I think we're dealing with people here who need at one level to be shown a great deal of love, who probably have post-traumatic stress disorder in many cases, certainly should not be exempt from public debate once they wade into a conversation about the Bill of Rights, but nevertheless who need to be treated as they are, which is children who are shocked. But there is no focus, and I don't say that with any glee. There is no focus. I mean, the leaders of that march are now fighting with Twitter personalities, and David Hogg is talking about climate change and social justice and student loans, and that's not a good sign for them, I think.
Too diluted. I've heard you speak before about the composition of people who own guns and are guns enthusiasts. The thought is, again, another myth that it's old, white, angry people. If you could speak a little bit about the real diversity.
Yeah, I was saying this morning at breakfast. I mean, I write a lot about this, and I also go to the gun range, and I go to gun stores, and I mean, I live in Florida now, and yet I still, they gaslight me, the media, on this after a while, because you just, every day, it's like, this is about white men, this is white angry men, this is white men, it's white men, they're angry, they're white. Did I mention they're white and they're men? And you start sitting there and you're like, okay, God, wow, maybe it's white men. And then And then you go to a gun store, as I did last week, or a gun show actually, in Jacksonville, Florida, and you think, oh, it's not white men. That's nonsense. 30% of the people there were black, 10% were Hispanic, I'd say 5% were Asian, the rest were white, and there were a lot of women. And that's what I see at every range and gun store and NRA rally in the country. And you know, it's actually one of the most sort of harmonious groups of people you'll ever meet. I mean, this is an odd thing to say, I suppose, but if the NRA was a threat, people would know it. There's 5 million members and 400 million guns. It's not a threat, and it's not one group of people. It never has been. And if anything, it's getting more and more and more diverse and more appealing. So yeah, I get suckered into this occasionally, and I think, gosh, is that true? But it is not.
So it's great to hear, and I think from the reaction we all sort of knew that, but it's nice to hear you say that. This is almost a little bit chilling. Someone wrote that you mentioned that it's unspeakable for a government elected by free people who then turn on them and try to disarm them, and yet similar people founded, and that happened in the UK and Australia. So what the heck? What happened?
Well, I mean, I don't think that the UK and Australia are about to become tyrannies, but I do think they've inverted the correct relationship between the citizen and the state, and I think that's a problem. And I also think that it leads to a loss of liberty in other areas because it changes what individuals expect from their government, and it changes how individuals come to see themselves. There are, of course, numerous examples throughout history of when tyrannies have managed to impose themselves. I mean, I must say, one of the things that changed my mind on this question was I looked back at the 20th century and I thought, 200 million people were killed by their own governments in the 20th century. And I thought, sorry, you're telling me the problem now is that individuals have too many rights? I mean, it's a very odd way of looking at what was a blood-soaked 100 years. There are, of course, problems that arise from having a well-armed population. There are. Sometimes people walk into schools. I'm not arguing, for what it's worth, that that's the price we pay. I don't think you can stop that with gun control. If I did, I might have different views. I genuinely don't believe you can stop it with gun control, absent some sort of massive confiscation campaign that would lead to a civil war and thereby defeat its own purpose. But whatever the downside to having too much liberty, the idea that it could ever come close to what we saw throughout the 20th century is just astonishing to me, and yet that does seem to be the presumption. But in countries that have strong traditions, Australia, the UK, I was about to say France, but I think I'm too American now to do that. In countries that have strong traditions, the problem is more subtle, but it is a problem. I don't think that it is the abundance of firearms that keeps American free speech free. Not at the moment, anyway. But I do certainly think that the alacrity with which Canadian citizens and British citizens have accepted censorship and hate speech laws, and people being put in prison for making mistakes, is tied to the same attitude that led to their being happy to be disarmed. And I don't want to change the underlying culture in America that causes individuals to push back.
Wayne LaPierre says that if the current gun laws on the books were enforced, we could significantly reduce gun violence and crime. Why do you think these laws are not forcefully enforced? Or is that true?
No, I do think it's true. I do think it's true. I'm glad to see straw purchases being enforced, or being prosecuted, I should say. I certainly don't think you can stop mass attacks with laws. We've seen in France that people will drive a truck into a crowd and kill 80 people. And even where there's strict gun control, you still see some of these attacks. You see fewer, although they're often more deadly, but you do see them. But yeah, day-to-day crime, I think that's absolutely right. There are a lot of laws on the books. Now, I'm willing to listen to the people who tell me that it's difficult to enforce laws. I agree. That's why I'm a libertarian. It is difficult to enforce laws. We don't have infinite resources. We don't know where people who commit crimes are or what their intentions are. But that's an argument against adding to the laws, surely. So yeah, I think, but and this is sort of the key point, I think. I do agree with him, but I would also say it's not a hypothetical. I mean, if in 1993, rather than starting to loosen the laws across the country, if in 1993 the United States had implemented strict gun control and every state had gone along, and we'd seen the massive, historic, astonishing drop in crime and gun violence that we have seen, all of the people who supported those laws would have said, look at what we had done, look at what we have achieved. When it's the other way around, though, when the laws that many of you support and I support, the sensible laws that don't go after people just to annoy them, when those are put on the books and they work, that doesn't annoy me, I'm pleased. Likewise, when concealed carry is passed and crime keeps going down, whether it is causing it or it's merely a correlation, especially given the predictions, I'm pleased. So yeah, I do think he's right, but I also think rhetorically we shouldn't concede to the left what they think is true, which is that the laws started to be loosened, the number of guns started to increase, and crime has skyrocketed, because precisely the opposite is the case.
This again gets back to the timely thing of school shootings, is that because we're reactive human beings, gun control of age often comes after a mass school shooting, yet only 1.5%, according to this author, of the deaths from school shootings, only 1.5% of all the deaths come from school shootings. So what are your thoughts as to how do we protect our schools and without relinquishing our rights?
I don't know. I don't know, and I'm happy to say it. This is a very open country. We don't want to lock every building down and track everybody. I'm very open to hearing ideas, but I don't know the answer. I do think that reacting in grief in the first few days after a shooting is a bad idea. I think history shows that, not just on guns. I think it shows that across the board. Again, this is difficult to make as an argument when people are grieving, but it is also true, it is indisputably true, that schools are safer than they were 20 years ago, that you are less likely to be killed or hurt in a school than you were 20 years ago, and that you are 5 times more likely to be struck by lightning as a school student than to be shot at. Now, that doesn't mean that what happened in Parkland is not appalling, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't try what we can to stop it. But it does mean that these are incredibly complex issues. Leah Lebresco, who's a statistician who used to work for 538 and is now writing sometimes at the Washington Post, she's not fond at all of guns. She would ban them all if she could. But she wrote a fantastic piece recently saying she had looked at every single gun death in America over a 5-year period of all types. And in her view, not a single sweeping law would have made a difference. That this is going to be an issue that is solved by communities, by families, by cultural change, and by individual intervention. And that is an unsatisfying answer, in part because it's so diffuse. Giving that answer is like saying, I don't know why free market economies work, or what is coming next in the free market economy, because I'm not the guy who's going to invent it, someone out there is. It's not a satisfying answer in a democracy, but I think it's the right answer. I don't know, let's try a bunch of things.
Along those lines, is there any kind of regulation you'd support?
Well, I support a lot of the laws on the books already. I think if you have been convicted of domestic assault, you should be prohibited from buying a gun, owning a gun. I think if you are a violent felon, you should be prohibited from owning a gun. I think that it should be illegal to buy a gun for somebody you know is not allowed one. I'm not greatly offended by background checks from commercial dealers. I do think that regulating me giving a gun to, my brother-in-law is an intrusion. But there are 20,000 gun control laws on the books. It's the most heavily regulated consumer product in the United States, and I don't oppose all of those rules. So no, but I also just don't want to add more to them in the name of doing something. And that line, we need to do something, why do you oppose everything, is really a cynical one. After Parkland, I went on CNN with Chris Cuomo because I hate myself. And he said, well, should we pass universal background checks in Florida? And I said to him, well, that's an interesting idea, but the studies just came out from Colorado and from Washington State, both of which added this, and showed that there was quite literally no difference whatsoever as a result of this law. And so I said, no, I don't think we should just do that, given that it seems not to work. And he said, well, we have to do something. We have to do something. Why are you opposed to it? So I said, well, what about arming teachers? And he said, no, we shouldn't do that. And I said to him politely, well, then you also oppose doing something, right? We can have an adult debate about this. And I think that point needs to be made more often. I mean, so if it is okay for me to say I don't want to do more gun control because I don't think it will work, then it is okay for a progressive to say they don't want concealed carry reciprocity, which is my position. It is fine to oppose that. It's fine to have that debate. But it's not just gun control advocates that oppose doing something. The rhetorical game here is stacked.
Yeah, that's right. Well, you're not a California expert, but you've been here for what? 36 hours, so maybe that's enough. Someone wants to know, would California be successful, or any other state, in instituting background checks before purchasing ammo, mandatory background checks?
Well, maybe. I used to live in Connecticut, and for all the freedom, and I there you have to show your firearms permit to buy ammo. The problem with introducing a background check is that it increases the cost of ammo. Which is regressive. I mean, that means that poorer people are less likely to be able to buy ammo. I think this is a general problem with some of these proposals. I've never been given a satisfactory answer to this question. Why is it that we assume that poorer Americans and disproportionately minorities are incapable of getting voter IDs or will be discouraged from voting because it is expensive, which is a fine argument. But it's not the case that if you ask someone to get a $200 gun permit with all the same process, fingerprinting, photographs, paperwork, and so on, that will discourage the same person from getting a gun, which is a constitutional right. Nobody has ever answered that question. And I think when it comes to the background checks on ammo, that does need to be answered. Background checks at a minimum for firearms purchases are $10. You're lucky if your FFL charges you $10. Why should it be any different for ammunition? And if it is different, it will be because the big box retailers can deal with the volume. So maybe Walmart says, well, we will just eat this cost. Maybe Dick's Sporting Goods says we will eat this cost, which in turn drives out smaller manufacturers and local businesses. And almost certainly does nothing to stop shootings because, again, people who cause routine problems for the police do not buy ammo from Walmart. They buy it from criminal networks that they largely establish from prisons. But I do not think that Gavin Newsom is likely to take my advice on this. So, yeah, could it happen? It could.
We'll make this our last question because then we'll get you down to sign some books. And on a cultural level, it seems that Second Amendment, it's a very hot topic in some communities, and others there's more antipathy for it. Or could you talk a little bit about what you've seen across the country, why certain areas have stronger opinions toward the Second Amendment than others?
Well, I think the Second Amendment is broadly popular, and I think there are pockets in which it's not, and we're sitting in one in which it's not tonight. I think there are probably two things driving the areas in which it is unpopular. The first is the more urban an area, the more likely people are to believe that they can rely on the authorities, and not irrationally. I mean, there are 30,000 police in New York City. The police there are very, very quick to respond. If you live in rural Idaho, they're not. You know, the old line is order a pizza and call the cops and see which one gets there first. And again, that's not the cops' fault, but they don't live in everyone's house. And so it's, but in New York they sort of do because they're everywhere. And so you do have differing attitudes to risk, which is rational, although I think is somewhat selfish to say, well, I'm not worried about my life, so those farmers can go screw themselves, which is essentially what they're saying. That's the first thing. And then I think this has become tied up with culture, as I say, with partisan politics and with the culture war. And I think that it all too quickly, during a gun control debate, bleeds into the sort of ugly characterizations of gun owners that we saw during the last election. I mean, if you follow the cartoons on this in places like Politico and The New Yorker, the first cartoon they always put up is depicting anyone who believes the Second Amendment is a constitutional right as somehow having blood on their hands. That's the first one they do. But within 2 or 3 days, they start drawing caricatures of gun owners, and they always look the same. They always have, they're always overweight. They always have straw coming out of their mouth. They're always wearing, in England we call them dungarees. I'm not sure what you call them here.
Overalls.
Overalls. They always have some sort of hat on, maybe a trucker hat. And I think that's how far too many people in cities believe gun owners are. But they're not. You know, almost half of Americans own guns. I mean, firstly, even if that was what gun owners all look like, it wouldn't matter. But as I said, if you go to any gun show or gun store, you will see all sorts of people there. All sorts of different education levels, all sorts of different races, religion. You see men and women. You see people of different ages. But I think that gun culture is so alien in some of these places that the strength of feeling is as much tied up with the ongoing culture war as it is the economic question of firearms.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming. See you next month. Charlie Cooke.